Now she is the antidote to bad news. That's how the racists are painting Kate. And her trip to Brick Lane dominates the local East London website news about Brick Lane. Kate actually spent more time on the northern side of Brick Lane than she did on the southern side of Brick Lane. We shall be talking about that later. Now, this is also in denial because it's completely based on the assumption that the care home people didn't die. And this is a kind of game. The Daily Mail is running this as if it's a game. And this is the latest U-turn. Well, maybe tomorrow there will be another U-turn because Rishi Sunak, the UK finance minister, is committing another contradictory kind of somersault or double somersault, where he's saying that jobs will be lost while he's causing more losses of jobs and more jobs by curtailing the already contradictory furlough scheme. Furlough scheme has been a means for the big business and hedge fund kind of crooks to loot most from the public purse. And then the Daily Mail admits, at least if not the details of the particular thing that Boris Johnson has got wrong, but the fact that it is even suggesting that Johnson-fronted regime has got anything wrong is historic. But then, talking about history and historic, Jeremy Corbyn, who has been paraded and who is allowed to be paraded as a special friend of the Palestinians and of Muslims, has come up with a novel way of denying that Muslims exist in Burma. He has called the victims of the Burmese genocide as Rohingya people, not Muslims, which is what the difference was. If they were Rohingyas and if they didn't belong to the Muslim faith, they wouldn't have been targeted. And the whole drive against the Muslims was led by the monks, the Buddhist monks in Burma, the same monks that the Dalai Lama belongs to and personifies the monksness. And Dalai Lama has been silent throughout the whole genocide and since. Now, Jeremy Corbyn, who has been paraded as a friend of the Muslims, and this is an objective analysis, it's not a sectarian or faith-based analysis, it's a fact-based analysis of the seriously intellectually deficient Jeremy Corbyn. He has penned a piece, or at least a piece has appeared with his name as the author, talking about the attack on the Rohingya people and the violence against the Rohingya people, not the genocide. Notice this. He's saying that the Rohingyas, his article doesn't even have one word, one occurrence of Muslim or genocide. Genocide to Jeremy Corbyn is violence, and Muslims are Rohingyas, not Muslims, which is why the Rohingya Muslims were targeted for the genocide by the Aung San Suu Kyi fronted genocidists in Burma. It's not my word. It's the evidence before the United Nations itself. The United Nations itself has evidence that it was genocide, and it was a genocide because the targets were Muslims. So to all those people who have been kind of parading Jeremy Corbyn should think about the evidence of the emptiness of this man. And it is his emptiness, as I have been saying, that has caused the series of events in British politics where the Johnson-fronted cabal is in place now at number 10 Downing Street as the UK government because of the emptiness and the intellectual unfitness of Jeremy Corbyn over 5 years that he was at the front of the Labour Party. Nothing to do with ideology, nothing to do with this so-called socialism. The guy is not even able to understand socialism. And he keeps coming up with these idiotic statements like he did at the weekend, when he did a kind of remote conference with some people. And the words he said, the sentences he said, the so-called narrative he presented lacked traction, lacked content, lacked substance, lacked relevance. So whenever in this country there is lack of traction by those who are in place in public office to serve the public, the question must be raised as to why they are failing or they are being exposed and caught as failing or refusing. I mean, Boris Johnson is the embodiment or personification currently, but he is not the first one, as I have just said. If Corbyn was in place instead of Boris Johnson, it is impossible to imagine that Corbyn would have done any better for the people in need. And I'm doing this by citing the example of Corbyn's denial of genocide of the Rohingya Muslims by the Burmese. That is the piece I have seen in the last few hours. So anyone who is paraded, or any entity or organization that is paraded as being kind of not extreme, not racist, and instead as being caring and concerned for the welfare of the people and concerned for the equality of society and all the other things. That is probably a summary of an NHS trust. So the Royal London Hospital mounted an mass eviction program in September 1987. This is September 2020. So it's 33 years ago. And as I have said in the previous editions, the reason why the Royal London Hospital mounted the mass eviction attacks on the people living in the properties that the Royal London Hospital in law owned like freehold. And it was triggered. Probably the Royal London Hospital was looking for a trigger or an excuse. And it was triggered by a complaint made by people who narrowly escaped being hit by falling ceiling in September 1987. And when the Royal London Hospital got the complaint and the legitimate and lawful, absolutely lawful, urgent demand that they repair the buildings, not just that building, but all the buildings in the street in New Road, Stepney, London E1. The same area which is the location of the Royal London Hospital, Whitechapel. So instead of doing the repairs, and instead of apologizing, and instead of offering some damages or similar to the victims of the targets of the falling ceiling, the Royal London Hospital decided to mount the mass eviction program against them, against the residents in all the properties in New Road. That was in 1987 September, and they immediately put the properties on auction. So the lines of the notices outside each property suddenly appeared within days of the falling ceiling. And remember, the Royal London Hospital's audacity, criminal audacity. It's the criminal actus reus, was contributed to and was contributed to by the local so-called building controls and safety guardian, the Tower Hamlets Council, and the Royal London Hospital criminals were emboldened by the corrupt and criminally complacent regime at the time in place in the local Tower Hamlets Council. So take a pause and think back to 1830s when T.B. Macaulay said that the people in the subcontinent, what is now Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, or Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, which had already been under 70 plus years of the East India Company fronted colonialism, British colonialism. Macaulay said that it was time to turn the brown people, he called the Pakistanis, Indians and Bangladeshis mainly brown people, into brown on the outside and English on the inside. And he thus produced his education program for turning the brown looking people into internally English people. His program was like the Uncle Tom, Nephew Tom's, the entire masses of the millions of people, hundreds of millions of people there, even then, turned them into internalized English people. And this is relevant to the discussion about Tower Hamlets Council and its role. During the years, the calendar years that Lutfur Rahman was in post as the so-called elected mayor in the name of Tower Hamlets Borough, in the public gallery so-called of the Mulberry Place. The public gallery is not really a public gallery because there are obstructions, visual obstructions between the people sitting as observers and the participants in the meeting. That is one of the unique features of Tower Hamlets Council's criminality and corruption and unfitness, geographical, physical unfitness. There would be often expressions of various emotional outrages or opinions by some of the people who spoke Siloti, and whenever they did that as a kind of side thing. It wasn't the main part of their contributions. But they did speak sometimes in Siloti, because most of the people were, as counselors, were Siloti-speaking Bangladeshis on both sides. And there would be shouts from the gallery where some Englishistic people would be among the public. And they would say, speak English or speak in English. Now, the point is about languages, whatever the language that one person speaks, human communications essentially reflect and mirror across languages, because the human experiences and interactions are mainly similar. In some cultural aspects, they are not similar for the unique reasons of cultural differences and histories. But essentially, the universal, the objective set of experiences are very similar. So regardless of what language a person speaks at a multilingual setting, like the Towners Council meetings, is bound to represent the experiences of people who speak other languages. The contents are similar, bound to be similar. But the racism motivating that cry, speak in English or speak English, is the focus of this conversation, this communication, this commentary, this diagnosis. Because when they spoke, impulsively, completely, as reflex kind of reaction to anyone daring to speak even one word that is not in English, that shows the complete zombified personalities of these people. These were zombies, linguistic zombies, cultural zombies, and racist zombies. And that showed the opposite of education, because these people were not educated ever about anything. So they grew up hearing English and thinking as reflex kind of thought, thinking English terms. They had no concept about conceptual analysis or substance. So this is called, in my language, Englishism, based on English, not necessarily including all the fascistic connotations, but Englishism quite literally on the surface, artificial. And in 1983, when I created the journal, Benth Bulletin, BENTH, Bangladeshis Educational Needs into Our Hamlets, that was not the full description, quite apart from the kind of grammar, which I had to correct. The full description was not my idea. If it was my idea, I would have not used needs, I would have said rights. But that was something that I took over as an organization which had just been formed a few weeks before I was elected by the present people at a meeting to join the executive, and I then decided to launch this magazine in May 1983. But in the August issue of the Benth Bulletin, I was dealing with Englishism, August 1983. And I was denouncing, evidentially, the propensity on the part of the racists who looked at the Bangladeshis as naturally disadvantaged. And they provided the cure as zombies, that learning English would amount to curing the inherent disadvantage among the Bangladeshis. Now, the Bangladeshi community, like any other linguistically and culturally kind of identifiable group of people, needs, and in the context of being in another country 5,000, 6,000 miles away from home or the original country, such a community is in higher need of universal education than there would be if they were indigenous or native born or native kind of background mainly. So there is no doubt about that. But the prescription preferred and imposed by the Englishistic racist morons was that the Bangladeshis were disadvantaged as of nature, as of their kind of DNA. And so therefore I dealt with that in August 1983 now. How long ago was that? That was another 4 years before the ceiling collapsed in the Royal London Hospital owned property in New Road. So 33 plus 4, how many years is that? It's 37 years. 37 years ago, nearly 40 years ago, I devised this diagnostic tool of denouncing the racists who are basing their racist patronage and idiotic impositions on their shallow understanding of language and culture. And they were saying that if the disadvantaged were taught English, their disadvantage would disappear. Now, that was 37 years ago. And today, 2020, 37 years later, I have done research 37 years more than what I had done 37 years before. And the evidence is consistent with my thesis based on universal objective findings that racists like Jeremy Corbyn and racist outfits like the Royal London Hospital and racist organizations like the Inner London Education Authority. Remember, the Banth organization was created to address the Inner London Education Authority's failures. But those people who were involved in the original naming of that organization were too compliant with the ILEA. And they, unlike me, disregarded or pretended to not see the evidence of the racism rampant in the ILEA's failures. It was not a failure, it was a negligent refusal to provide service, which is exactly what happens every time. The Royal London Hospital racistly refused to provide service of safe housing, safe properties to the people. Most of the people living in the properties were Asians, Bangladeshis. And so therefore the Royal London Hospital decided to deny service that legally at common law they were obliged to provide. So they created a diversion, a criminal conception to put the properties on auction and get short of the complaining tenants and residents. So this is something that is uniquely being observed here and remembered in public about the darkness at the center of the attitude of those who manage and devise the agenda for the Royal London Hospital. It's a hospital, it's an NHS hospital, one of the biggest in the whole of the UK. But it is also dominated by one of the darkest gang of racists that actually controls its level of service and the kind of provision of frequency of the service and the quality of service. And the same applies to Jeremy Corbyn. If he were in government, like some of his peddlers wanted him to be PM, if he were in government, the record of the Labour Party, the record of the left, including Ben, who Corbyn claims to resemble, the record of the Labour Party shows that the Labour Party is as racist, if not more racist, than the Conservatives. It's not something I would like to see, but that is the undeniable conclusion based on the evidence and the record of the Labour Party. And people like Corbyn and other so-called left Labour MPs, like former MP Ken Livingstone, are known to have racist or race-based or ethnicity-based hostility to people of Scotland, for example. Now, I noticed the racism by anti-Scottish racism and hostility by Ken Livingstone in the early part of the decade, first decade of the century, when Livingstone was in post as the recently kind of elected mayor at the expense of London. And Livingstone was making pitches on behalf of the big business agenda setters in the city of London. And he was churning out lines like, London is nasal sound. London is subsidizing Scotland. London is giving too much money to Scotland. Now, if anyone looks at the evidence of the movement of this referendum and the demand for Scottish independence over the last decades, they can see that that particular tendency expressed in London, regardless of which political party, Conservative or Labour, against the Scottish people and the Scottish society, the Scottish economy. That is where it began. And the failure of the Labour Party in Scotland as against the SNP is directly linked to the anti-Scottish hostility and prejudice openly expressed by Labour politicians, including the so-called left Labour politicians. And so today's revelation that Jeremy Corbyn is an anti-Muslim, racist, in denial of the genocide that the Muslims were targeted by in Burma, merely updates the evidence of the Labour Party having no left at all. And my 1981 thesis, left out of the media, loom, was based on the then obvious and then just recently kind of happened coup staged by Ken Livingstone against Andrew McIntosh, who as the leader of the GLC Labour Party, Labour group, had won the election of 1981, the GLC election, and had been thrown out of his leadership position within 24 hours by a coup staged by Ken Livingstone, aided and abetted by John McDonnell and others. And I had been already studying the total emptiness of the British left. And I noticed that not only were they being sidelined by the mainstream capitalist right-wingers, but that even if the capitalist right-wingers wanted to give them some space, the British left was made up of empty heads, essentially, or of racists that fill their empty heads with too much racism and denial, which is how Jeremy Corbyn has come across today in his denial of genocide against the Rohingya Muslims and in his denial of the Muslim identity of the victims of the genocide by the Burmese. So the dilemma here that society faces is a dilemma what to do to serve the public, to serve the community, serve the public and the society at a time of crisis. A crisis like this one, Boris Johnson is going from one extreme to the other and compelling even the Johnson and Brexit supporting Daily Mail to paint him as desperate. And the evidence is that there is no avenue for seeking fairness and fair outcome by going through the existing mechanisms, so-called, and institutions. So there is a deepening hole developing and getting worse by the day in Britain, in public life. Now, whether it's linked with any external forces or external influences is secondary. The people in this country, the people who are directly involved in the decisions and also in the consequences and effects of the decisions are the ones that have to make the move and take the actions to defend the rights and to defend the values and to deliver to society what society needs and to defend and protect the concept and the idea of a public service at every level. Accountable, unbiased, unprejudiced public service to the public, regardless of the background of individual members of the public as to the ethnicity or faith or nationality, whatever. When the Benth Bulletin published this analysis about the English kind of Englishism, let me read this one, what I wrote in the August edition of the Benth Bulletin. So I was dealing with the claim that people, Bangladeshis, were not proficient, enough Bangladeshis were not proficient in English. Now, I did not learn English from the English. I learned English from my own kind of family, and I learned it myself as I was growing up in the village. The village that Sarah Bosley has never visited, but she disparagingly referred to my village and said that I came from the village. Of course, I grew up in the village, but I didn't come here from the village, you moron. I came actually here in a flight from Calcutta. And before that, I was in Dhaka. And so therefore, this criminal disparaging of me as a person coming from the village constitutes perfect example of how deeply racist, ignorant and stupid and uneducated the Guardian is. Sarah Bosley is now health editor, so-called, and I shall be diagnosing her sickness in due course at great length that she has been deserving since she penned that idiotic piece at my expense in March 1992 in The Guardian. And her core racist criminals who also attacked or looked for attacks or attack excuses to attack me to kind of put me in a spotlight because of the campaign I was at that time leading and organizing in defense of the parents of the school that was known as the Stratford School in the London Borough of Newham. Not far from the Stratford venue where the 2012 games were staged. Again, with the participation of the likes of Ken Livingston Livingstone having invented a lot of promises about helping the people of Newham, especially people in Newham in poverty and low pay and bad housing and all the rest of it. Most people in Newham have not benefited. In fact, the number can be counted in one hand. The point is that there is no accountability. All these liars, all the false promisers, and all the fakers, and all the unfit people and the racists in various public positions, they are in the way of the people getting what the people deserve and need. So what is happening here is that there is absolutely no accountability in the context of Keir Starmer and his sacking of anyone who dares to vote with a conscience in the House of Commons. So Starmer is tinkling and tinkering. And what will happen is that Starmer would be exposed as being unfit himself, which will not take us to Corbyn, hopefully. It should take us to somebody who can actually deliver both a narrative and a commentary and the value and an ethics and the morality that both the parliamentary Labour Party needs and the House of Commons needs and this society needs from the elected politicians. So, what would Starmer do if he were Corbyn and writing that piece about the Muslims being targeted by the genocidist Burmese? Starmer would not do a word differently. And that is where the Labour MPs failed during the promotion of the 1972-71 Immigration Act. The 1971 Immigration Act was pushed through by the government of the day, and the Labour MPs failed to oppose its racist content. And today, the 1971 Immigration Act is still the main instrument, racist instrument against migrants and against victims of genocide and other causes that force people to seek asylum anywhere outside of their own country or region. And there is no narrative in the Labour Party for compliance with the charter, the declarations, the conventions, the agreements, and the aims of the United Nations, which is celebrating 75th year today, this week. And in the coverage of the 75th year anniversary by the United Nations, the American networks and their collaborators in India, especially those ones that have been set up with the American kind of networks help to mount or maintain a propaganda network or propaganda platform in strategic locations against China. They are obsessed with the relationship between the diplomatic power brokers and power wielders. They're not talking about individual people. They're not talking about individual society. They're not talking about persons being denied the United Nations own declarations and charters and conventions. So in the United Nations, it is called United Nations, but it is not United Nations. In practice, it is united platforms for despots, dictators, and criminals in posts as heads of government in their countries, and there is no alternative. What should have happened from 1948 onwards was the emergence of the alternative platforms and facilities for carrying out the actual aims, founding aims and objects of the United Nations. And for carrying those out against the behavior of the despotic, corrupt, criminal, fascistic governments in the countries, member countries. This preacher man, Anthony Guterres, who is the Secretary General, has been overdoing this kind of shadow boxing and kind of remote kind of glorification. He, as I have said, poses near the pictures of Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and M.K. Gandhi. These are the things that he does. But he doesn't say that so many countries, member countries of the United Nations, are currently, this week, murdering people, torturing people. He doesn't publish those data. So he poses in front of the United Nations television and smiles smugly, and he spews banalities. So the United Nations has been kind of betrayed, if you like, by the bureaucracy for 72 years, since 1948. And it is time for the United Nations to become the organization, the world body that upholds and carries out the aims, its founding aims and objects. Now, there is no chance that Corbyn even has heard of the United Nations. And Corbyn is not alone. It seems that the licensed law trader, Keir Starmer, hasn't heard of the United Nations either. Oddly, it was Ed Miliband who referred to the United Nations in his attack on the completely dysfunctional and unfit Boris Johnson 2 Mondays ago. So the United Nations needs to be worked on, and the founding aims and objects of the United Nations must be carried out by a forum or series of forums that must be brought into being in order to save the world, save the planet, and of course save the United Nations as well. Otherwise it will happen. It is quite possible that the United Nations will meet the fate of the League of Nations. And the criminals in power in each of their countries will conspire directly or indirectly to destroy the United Nations. It is that urgent and it is that bad. And the evidence that in the member countries, among the institutions, among the organizations, among the politicians, there is no sign of any recognition of the values and the aims and purposes of the United Nations is to be found in the behavior of the Royal London Hospital, which launched the mass eviction program against tenants and occupants of the properties in 1987. And we shall be continuing to look deeper into the role of the Royal London Hospital and other agencies, institutions in the programs that will follow this one.